So welcome back, everybody. We're very happy to have the president of the Eurogroup with us today, Paschal Donohoe, and he's also finance minister of the Republic of Ireland. Great to have you with us. Thanks for...
Thank you very much, Markus. Thank you very much for the invitation and looking forward to our discussion.
Thanks. So we will have a discussion about various topics touching Europe and the United States and the global world. Here I put an outline together where we give a roadmap. So hopefully we can talk about financial stability first, then we touch about the digital euro or digital currency more generally. We talk about the fiscal policies in Europe and to what extent the US fiscal policies might spill over to Europe, about international tax competition and climate change policy, and at the end about some Brexit lessons, what we have learned from Brexit more generally for Europe and for Ireland. So let me start with financial stability. Of course, we have a lot of financial stability issues at the moment, but it seems like everything is easy money is all around. Is it something we should be worried about, that the money is too easy and it might create troubles down the road and we might have some financial stability issues to worry about? Is the Eurogroup thinking along these lines? Should we impose macroprudential measures now? Or is it too early, as long as we don't out of the COVID recession? I would like to get some perspective on that, what you're thinking.
So the Eurogroup view would be that the level of budgetary intervention that we have in our economies at the moment and the support from the central bank in Europe, the ECB, is the right policy response to the challenges that we are facing. If you look at the collapse in our private sector across 2020, due to the public health guidance and the need for very strong public health measures, and if you look at the continuation of that into 2021, I do believe budgetary intervention of the scale that happened was the right response. And in order to enable that kind of budgetary intervention, the Central Bank of Europe put in place a particular monetary policy stance. We will get to a point from a budgetary policy point of view that we will need to change that level of intervention. But currently at the moment within the Euro area, we still believe that a level of supportive budgetary intervention is appropriate. And while a rebound will begin to occur in the second half of the year, and we have increased our Euro area growth forecasts now to 4.5%, we need to recognize that a rebound is not the same thing as a full recovery. So I believe the budgetary stance at the moment is appropriate, but as we get into next year in particular, we will need to change it.
And you see that most of the change would come from the ECB side or more from the macroprudential side, financial regulation to make sure that there are no bubbles and other.
So as always in these kind of discussions, I should preface my answer by saying that the Central Bank of Europe, or ECB, is an independent institution, and I respect the decisions they make with regard to monetary policy. They have indicated that the level of monetary policy intervention that is in place, they will commit to maintaining up to March 2022. If I, however, deal with fiscal policy, in which I can speak with more authority, what will happen as we move through 2022 is you will see the economic support levels begin to change. And I believe they would change in two ways. The first one is that they would change from being general to sectorally focused and focus in particular parts of our economy that could be threatened by a multi-speed recovery. And then secondly, by becoming more sectorally focused, as we move through 2023, the magnitude of the support at a national level will begin to change. The other reason the magnitude of support at a national level will begin to change is the Recovery and Resilience Fund, which is the central intervention from the European Union, will become stronger and stronger in 2023. and you'll see the composition of fiscal intervention also begin to change.
So the spirit of the European Recovery Fund is not really a stimulus package, unlike in the United States, because it comes fairly late in the crisis, I guess. Is it more like a structural reform package to, bring certain countries to handle, on the one hand, the COVID crisis, but also to restructure themselves and make the economy?
I think it's a combination of both. In preparing for our discussion, Markus, I read the paper that you wrote entitled A Crash Course into the Euro Crisis, where you summarized the 7 different concepts of financial difficulty that ran through Europe beginning in 2008 and 2009. And one of the key points that you analysed and called out is that for much of that crisis, even though the ECB was intervening very strongly, it did not have a fiscal counterpart, and it didn't have a fiscal cover to act as an amplifier for their monetary policy interventions. And what is very important for the Recovery and Resilience Fund is, firstly, it will amplify the stimulus impulse that is moving through the euro area. So to be very precise, I don't see it only taking the place of national economic interventions. Secondly, however, it will have a structural requirement, which I think is different to much of the American fiscal intervention. But thirdly, it will be on top of the automatic stabilizers that are embedded into the European policy intervention. And I feel at times the concept of an automatic stabilizer does a disservice to the strength of the safety nets that are normalized in European economic policy. And they're the 3 ways in which I believe it is, quite distinctive, both to the last crisis and also to what is happening within America at the moment. And is a profound difference, as your paper, would have analysed, to the last crisis of a decade ago.
So let's come to the European Recovery Fund. So some people say, it's a one-shot measure, and we have set up a European Recovery Fund to deal with the COVID crisis. And others say, it's more a permanent shift. It's a Hamiltonian moment where, there will be some tax base at the European level, like what Hamilton did for the United States 200 years ago. So how do you see this? Is it a one-shot event, or is it a permanent shift that we move many more powers, essentially fiscal powers, more to the European level?
So it is a temporary and massive intervention. The political consensus within the European Union is that this is an emergency response to an existential health and economic emergency that we faced. So the political consensus is there for that, and it is a massive intervention of 650 billion euro, and critically, that intervention is channeled into parts of the euro area and the European Union, which are most at risk and face the greatest economic pressure from COVID due to the nature of their economies. But as you well know from thinking about the European Union and writing about it, every intervention in the European Union, every design within the European Union, which is a response to a crisis, does alter the political and economic landscape of the future as well. I know you're very familiar, and I think you've referred to how Monnet used to think about the development of European economic integration. And he pointed to the importance of crises in how they can amend and alter the political and economic architecture of the European Union. So this is an emergency temporary response. And when it is finished, in a number of years' time, it will still build our capacity of what we believe is conceptually possible within the European Union. I genuinely hope it is never repeated again. I hope we never have to face a crisis of the scale of COVID. but it will lead to how we think about the European Union differently in the future. It will mean we're more aware of our capacities and what we can achieve together. And if I may say, I think one policy intervention that has not yet received the academic and analytical focus that it deserves is the SURE programme, which is a borrowing programme that was launched by the European Commission to help member states more effectively fund their wage subsidy schemes. And that allowed wage subsidy schemes that 25 to 30 million European citizens were on to be funded more cheaply than many European Union countries could do on their own. And likewise, I hope we don't have to, I hope schemes like that are needed less in the future, but we've learned from how it has worked. And that will help us think differently about our future as well.
So at some point, this 750 billion euros, which, new bonds will be issued, have to be serviced. And there was some talk at some point about a digital tax or some other taxes at the European scale. Do you envision anything, or is it the digital tax, is it off the table, or is it still on the table? Or?
So I know if there was any environment in which, you would be comfortable in me using technical jargon and language, it surely would be talking to you, Markus, and to your audience, given your understanding of all of these issues. So allow me to pluck the concept of own resources and bring this into our discussion. And as many of your colleagues and students will know, own resources is the concept that we use within the European Union for common taxes that either fully fund the European Union or a share of the revenue from them goes to the European Union. And as some of your colleagues will know, for example, some of our indirect taxes within the European Union are used to fund how the EU itself works. And yes, the debate now in relation to own resources has changed within the European Union. For example, we're now going to recommit ourselves to work in relation to how our tax in relation to plastics and waste will begin to change, and how such a tax can make a contribution to funding the work of Europe and indeed the recovery fund. And yes, there's going to be a further debate in relation to digital taxes and levies within the European Union and whether they can become an own resource. Now, I should make clear in answering this part of your question that as president of the Eurogroup, I don't speak about taxation matters. That sits purely with national finance ministers, and different ministers have different views. But I would generally say that the future background to own resource debates within the European Union has changed because of COVID, and also because the recovery fund is strengthening our response back to COVID. And I think you'll see the first example of that in the negotiation on taxes on plastics, and I think that's likely to continue across the coming years.
So then there's another component, which is the Maastricht Treaty, or this, the implementation of the Maastricht Treaty in form of rules. There's a big debate going on also in the academic community to move from rules to standards and perhaps move away from the 60%, 3% rule and have other ways to do it. What's the current thinking among the council members?
So again, and yes, well, actually, you're correct in your original question to me. Because as president of the Eurogroup, I have the great privilege of representing my colleagues within the Euro area. And of course, the issue about rules is EU-wide as opposed to Euro area specific. And it is actually a matter for the Council of the European Union, which in this case is ECOFIN, the finance ministers of all of the European Union, as just opposed to the Euro area. And I put a lot of my focus on building up a political consensus on what we think the right budgetary policy of the Euro area should be. And I believe the ability of the Euro area to recover has been underestimated. And I believe the impact of our Euro area budgetary decisions has been underestimated in the analysis of them by many. But to deal with your question about whether we're going to move from rules to standards, I believe we will still be rules-based. And I believe in any discussion regarding the economic architecture of the European Union and the Euro area, it will be rule-based. And the reason for that is, I think in some forms of economic policy, it is easy to imagine a standards-based common area. But in something as fundamental as sharing a currency, the foundations are not strong enough if they're only standards-based. The architecture needs to be firmer, which is why it will be rules-based. And as you'll be aware, our colleagues in the European Commission are planning some public consultation in relation to that later in the year. But they've also, given a preliminary indication that the general escape clause will continue to play a role in 2022. But in any discussion, Markus, it will be about rules rather than standards.
And there's also in the US, there's a big debate that we have to rethink the debt sustainability aspects, because the real interest rate these days is so low compared to what it was 10 or 20 years ago. Is this entering in the debate in Europe as well? Is this a big issue that, going away from 60% or 3%, or is it less of an issue because interest rates might also spike up again down the road?
So it is an area of debate, of course it is, and of course you will be more aware than I am of the debate that is now underway regarding inflationary expectations and what that will mean for interest rates in the future. And the debate that is taking place within the Euro area at the moment would be along the lines of recognizing that the debt sustainability discussion is very different to where we were a decade ago because of the monetary policy environment that we are in. But that is not going to remove our obligations regarding how we manage our debt sustainably. And particularly within the Euro area, that requirement to manage debt sustainability, to manage our debt sustainably and be aware of our debt commitments will always be very high, because we're a group of countries sharing a currency, as opposed to in the jurisdiction that you're in, a single country with a single currency. And because we are sharing a currency with each other, our commitments to each other are high, and the debt sustainability commitments will therefore always be important to us because of the many transmission mechanisms that exist within a single currency zone. So in the rules discussion that will develop at the right point and at a sensible time, the discussions regarding debt sustainability will still be there. The context will change a little bit, but our concerns about managing our debt in the future will still be there.
So you drew already a lot of connections and differences between the US and Europe. I was just wondering whether we can go a little bit deeper into this direction, because in the US, at least, there's a new momentum of huge fiscal spending, also in order to heal the country, from disparities and disagreements within the country. Do you see that Europe might follow a different push or the same push as the US, or do you think the challenges for Europe are very different, and hence you also expect a different fiscal policy for Europe as well?
But firstly, of course, from a political point of view and from an economic point of view, of course, I want to really welcome the commitment to economic multilateralism and cooperation from President Biden and Secretary Yellen, and how committed they are to those principles, and their efforts to rebuild economic and social inclusivity and to strengthen the American economy is something that benefits us all. It's a public good. In terms of Europe, however, and other parts of the world, I think it's really important we respond back to our own challenges and also our own opportunities, and decide what is the right budgetary and monetary policy for us here in Europe. And I think it would be important to make the point that the starting position for Europe is very, very different in comparison to America. And if I give a simple example of it, many of the payments that were included in President Trump's stimulus plan and in President Biden's stimulus plan, many of them would be automatic within Europe. So what is a stimulus intervention in America is an automatic policy response in all of Europe and in all of the euro area. So our starting position is quite different because our social insurance systems are fundamentally different. But that being said, we of course have our own challenges in relation to inclusive growth and into continuing to build our social contract. Those challenges are here as well. Before we encountered this pandemic, before we had to deal with this health emergency, many citizens across Europe did not feel that the social contract was serving them well. They did not feel that the recovery after the global financial crisis was giving them wage growth, was giving them living standards that were acceptable. And in a post-COVID Europe, or in a Europe in which COVID is no longer a health emergency, those concerns will re-emerge. And as an advocate of the European project, and as a believer in the politics of the political centre here in Europe, I have a duty to respond back to that and to work with my colleagues to respond to it. But that is why the Recovery Fund, which we began our discussion with, is really important in the euro area and in the European Union, because that is our way of responding back to the need for a transition to a lower carbon future, to invest in human capital, to move to a new Europe that meets the needs of a digital economy, but to do it in a socially acceptable way. So while recognizing that our nets may be stronger in Europe than in America, our safety nets, here in Europe, our safety nets need to lift people up higher as opposed to just always catching them. And that is what we need to do now here in Europe. And similar challenges in America.
So let me just go to the spillovers of US policy. On the one hand, you might say in the US having a stimulus policy might spill over to Europe and benefit Europe by having more export possibilities towards the US. But on the other hand, it might also lead to higher interest rates in the United States, which might hurt a lot of emerging economies, just reminding of taper tantrums and aspects like that. And that hurts again European exports towards emerging economies. How do you think, are the advantages larger for Europe, or the disadvantages through the emerging economies will be larger? What's your take at this?
So look, as always, if I respect the independence of interest rate and monetary policy within the euro area, I certainly do that when I'm talking about colleagues in another economy and in another part of the world, particularly our colleagues in America. I leave their monetary policy to your own leaders. Overall, there are always risks and challenges in every economic intervention in such a globally integrated economy as we have at the moment. And overall, the intervention and leadership of your leaders in America are ones that are very, very positive for us here in Europe. They create stronger export markets, and they deepen the confidence that financial markets and citizens have about our ability to get out of this crisis. And that is good for all of us. And while there may be challenges and consequences of such action, I believe the costs and risks of inaction would have been exponentially greater, economically and also politically. And what we all need to do now is work in fora like the G7 and the OECD and the IMF to see how we can continue to coordinate our efforts to manage those risks. And that's why the commitment of President Biden and his team to economic multilateralism is so important.
So perhaps we can move to international taxes. That's also a huge component to have some international coordination. And the Biden administration on Janet Yellen essentially pushed forward a huge minimum corporate tax, which is a big change for the United States. What do you think, what is Europe's best response to that, and Ireland's best response to such an initiative? Are you open-minded to what's corporate minimum tax, and what are the repercussions for other countries or the benefits for other countries?
So I guess, again, it's at this point, Markus, I have to take make very clear that as president of the Eurogroup, yes, I can't comment on tax matters. So I'll take my president of the Eurogroup hat off and put my finance minister of Ireland hat on, because of course I do want to answer your questions, because they're very serious and very important ones. If it is absolutely the mandate and the right of Secretary Yellen and President Biden to decide they want to tax American companies differently, and we fully respect that and respect the mandate they have to make those decisions. In terms of Ireland's response back to it, the way, as you know, the global architecture will be negotiated and put in place will be through the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, in which America is indeed an anchor member of. And the points that Ireland is making within the OECD and will make within Europe has a number of different levels within it. The first one is, we know the world of corporate tax policy has to change because the global economy is changing and big companies within it have changed so quickly as well in nature and scale. Secondly, Ireland has already made massive changes in our corporate tax policy in recent years that sometimes don't get the credit or recognition that I would argue they should. So, for example, the so-called Double Irish Agreement that many were critical of for so long of is completely gone from the Irish tax code. The concept of stateless companies completely eliminated from our tax code. And many of the concepts that some of your colleagues will be familiar with in Princeton in relation to things like controlled foreign companies, hybrids, tax mismatches, mandatory tax disclosure. We've implemented and dealt with many of those issues in recent tax legislation that I've brought through our Parliament. And what we will be saying in the debate that is underway now in relation to the future of corporate tax policy, it's that it's not just really big economies that want to be competitive and want to use corporate tax policy as a way of maximizing their own revenue. Smaller countries want to do it too. We are a country that does not have economic advantage by scale, by size, or by location. And tax policy is part of our economic policy and part of our economic model, but not all of it. And we'll be making the case for countries that have lower rates, but accept that tax competition in the future has to be legitimate and has to be inside certain parameters. And that's the way we're going to engage in this area, Markus. It is very difficult. It is an area that has a very high political profile, and I accept that. But I do believe we're going to get an agreement. And I do believe the future of global tax policy is going to be different. And we want to play a role in trying to get that agreement.
So within the academic community, there's a big debate going on whether we should just, let's say, have what's now proposed, a minimum corporate tax, which is like taking the existing tax regime and just modifying it, or to have a radical overhaul of the whole tax system, which makes it much harder to shift profits, from one country to the other country. Is there any, in the political arena, is there any debate on this as well, or is this too academic to really change the whole tax system?
No. I'm pleased to be able to tell you that us humble politicians have transferred many of your concepts into international tax policy. And the version of the academic debate that you're referring to are, of course, the Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 work streams within the OECD, one pillar being the rate and the other pillar being the base. And both of them are very, very active areas of political debate. I think it's fair to say, however, that one of the things the academic community does acknowledge is the complexity that is involved in base reallocation decisions. It is an extraordinarily technically complicated area. At its most simple level, if you were to evolve the global tax architecture, that you tax on the basis of where consumption occurs as opposed to where value is created, that would be a really significant change that would involve change across multiple jurisdictions over a prolonged time period. And that in turn is why race decisions can be more attractive, because as you say, they sit on top of existing national tax architectures, and that is why they can be more attractive. And if, from my point of view, I think it is increasingly likely that the final settlement on these matters will probably could contain elements of both, but may not be able to include all the elements of both, because the complexity involved in both is so big. And really, from our point of view, in both those work streams, they're really sensitive for small economies, and they're really sensitive in particular for small economies that export services, but a lot of focus on export performance to support our overall economic models. And this is why it's such a politically important area for many of my colleagues.
So one thing you mentioned already before for the European Recovery Fund is, of course, the climate aspects, but more generally, the whole climate component. And there's also a tax implication if Europe, goes for different climate policy than the US. And the US seems to be going for a very different strategy, not too much of a carbon tax, but much more industry focused. And then the issue of border adjustment tax comes up. So if you want to export into Europe, and then you have to pay a border adjustment tax, other countries like the US might see this as a protectionist measure. What's your response to that? Or do you see the border adjustment tax coming? Or what's the current thinking on this dimension?
So, my God, Markus, if the reallocation of tax basing within global tax policy is complicated, that even is mild in comparison to some of the policy complexity behind the border adjustment tax. I think this is an area within which we will struggle to make progress quickly. And the reason for that is I do believe there is an awful lot of political commitment at the moment to how we can deepen our existing trade connections with each other and deepen economic multilateralism. And I think it is going to be a challenge for a while to implement carbon border adjustment levies in a synchronized way across the global economy, while also at the same time looking to optimize global trade flows, and particularly doing it at a time of economic fragility. If you were to ask me to pick a priority, and again, this is tax, so I'm just speaking as Finance Minister of Ireland, I think the future of carbon pricing and carbon taxation is an area that is a more important priority for me as Finance Minister for Ireland. So here in Ireland, we have now committed to automatic increases in carbon taxes for every budget until we hit our target of €100 of tax revenue. No, excuse me, of €80 of additional carbon tax revenue per tonne of carbon emissions. And that is something that I believe is fundamental to how we prepare for moving to a lower carbon future. And of course, it's really difficult to do that while at the same time implementing border adjustment levies.
So let's go a little
this
bit
is real. This is stuff really for the academic community now. This is because the complexity in all of this, Markus, as you know, is so deep.
So there's even more complexity once we go to climate change, I guess. Let's go a little bit deeper.
I can see you're just warming up for the really difficult stuff now.
So there's the whole of green finance. So if you go to carbon tax versus ESG investing, and some people argue, can you really make a difference through ESG investing? You know, if the funding cost of a company is 10 basis points cheaper, if they become more green, does it really, is it just an excuse not to implement the carbon tax to make it more provocative? So the carbon tax really will carry the burden and ESG is not doing so much. Is this
so again, to give my national perspective on that, I believe we have to do both. I believe very strongly. And the reason why the ESG framework is so important is a fundamental insight to how we have to respond back to the climate crisis. Is that public capital on its own will be insufficient for it. We have to fundamentally change the incentives that are at the heart of our mixed economies. And that is why ESG, I believe, has a really important role to play in it. In the European Commission, and in fact, the commissioner who is responsible for this is an Irish person, Mairead McGuinness. She has just launched taxonomy proposals now on behalf of the Commission that's looking to embed ESG into how companies have to report on their performance and report to their investors. And I believe it's essential. I also believe the younger generation of citizens who are the current and future generations of investors want to know this, have a right to know it, and need transparency in their investment choices. So I don't believe it's either or. I believe both should follow. And then in the area of green finance, where I believe Europe and European sovereigns have a role to play, I believe the whole area of how euro-denominated green bonds are developing is a really, really important area. 38% now of all green bonds that are being issued globally are euro-denominated. Versus, I think, America, the dollar, I think, has around a 30% share of of green bonds, and I think China is around 14%. And I think this is something that Europe will want to do a lot more of in the future.
So one complication is, of course, to define what's green and what's brown. And if you look at the ESG standards, there's some recent studies coming out of the IMF, and other academics have shown that the correlation between ESG bonds and pollution is very, very low. It's almost not there. So what can the official sector do in order to improve the correlation, or at least make ESG standards more meaningful from an environmental and governance structure perspective?
We need to have more consistency, which is why the Commission taking an initiative on this within the European Union is really important. Consistency across as many investment zones as possible, I believe, will be a big contribution to the challenge that you're facing. But I also believe, despite the urgency of the situation that we're in, I also still believe there needs to be a bit of time for kind of generosity in appraising these initiatives and the recognition that it will take time for them to become more and more rigorous and more beneficial in our efforts. So, for example, I believe the ESG methodologies that we have at the moment, yes, they do have difficulties. Yes, they do not always deliver against the objectives that we set for them. But I also believe they're going to get better and they're going to get more rigorous. And one of the reasons why I believe that will happen is more and more investors will demand that and will be interested in it. So I am aware of, many of the so-called, greenwashing criticisms that would be there at the moment. And I think, in fairness, some of those criticisms do have some validity. But I'm also very, very conscious and confident that our methodologies will improve over time and maybe more quickly than some of our critics would expect.
So let's move on to the ECB, because Madame Lagarde is also very much keen in incorporating climate change in ECB policy. Do you think it's a secondary mandate of the ECB to do so? And some argument is, when you do collateral policy and monetary policy, you should take the risks into account, and some of these risks are environmental risks. Others argue, green projects are typically more risky than non-green projects, because green projects are concerned with the very long run, and you have a lot of interest rate risk exposure, essentially. So very long run projects are essentially more risky, and hence green projects will be more risky.
Sure.
How do you see this within the ECB? What should the ECB do? Should it be focused primarily on price stability as its core mandate is, or should it also adopt some secondary mandates as well?
So firstly, to deal with the central banking dimension of your question, I absolutely support the work that President Lagarde and the Governing Council of the ECB are doing at the moment with regard to this. And as you will know, they're currently conducting a strategic review of the work of the bank with a view to what their policy framework will be in the future. And there's two reasons why I support the work that the ECB are doing at the moment. Firstly, unfortunately, if not tragically, climate change could well become, and it maybe already is, a financial stability issue. It will affect how so many economies are able to structure themselves and perform in the future. And even if we are successful in avoiding such a tragic horizon, it will still affect the transmission mechanism of monetary policy, because as economies themselves begin to change due to climate, the ability of the ECB in setting its own monetary policy and then making decisions about how it regulates banks will inevitably be influenced by the process of climate change. So for those two reasons, I believe the work of the ECB is absolutely appropriate. And President Lagarde regularly briefs the finance ministers of the euro area on her work. But we also need to avoid allowing this to be an area of primary responsibility for our central banks. If finance ministers have a fundamental role to play here, which leads on to your second question regarding the riskiness of green projects. And it's at this point that I'd make the point to you that in the riskiness of green projects is an area that's the responsibility of finance ministers, not our central bank leaders. And this is why your questioning to me earlier on regarding the future of carbon taxation is so important. Because, of course, what carbon taxes can do is it can level the field in investment decisions that are made more or less risky regarding the nature of climate change in the future. So, for example, if an investment decision is bad for our environment in the future, but less risky in the present, because it's potentially a more stable economic transaction, then the carbon pricing and carbon taxes that it pays now in the future should reflect that. And that is why, for example, here in Ireland, I'm not talking about carbon pricing in 2021. I'm talking about what carbon pricing will be in 2025, because I want to influence the investment decisions here in Ireland so that a decision that's more risky now will seem more stable in the future, because the carbon pricing of today reflects that. And that's not a policy area that I can abdicate to central bank leaders. It's a decision for me. So
a lot of the riskiness essentially is also policy risk, and that's a new control essentially.
Absolutely, very much so.
So let's move on. Another area of the ECB is essentially introducing a digital euro, and you know, CBDC, central bank digital currencies. All the countries are thinking about it right now, and some smaller countries have already implemented it. So where do you see the big motivation for the euro area to have a digital euro?
So this is an area, again, that our central bank are leading on, and President Lagarde gives the Eurogroup a regular update on the work that is underway with regard to that. And they have just completed, as you may well be aware, a very large public consultation regarding the digital future of the euro. And before the summer, they will make, they have a decision to make regarding whether they will continue their exploratory work with regard to an euro, and we'll be getting an update from that from President Lagarde before the summer. But there are two impulses that are described, two catalysts for this work at the moment. The first one is a recognition that as our economies are profoundly changing due to digital innovation, our means of payment are also changing due to digital change. And secondly, in the imperative that we have to protect and enhance the sovereignty of our euro in the generations and years to come, and also to protect the stability of it and the use of it, that means we need to consider whether it's going to have a digital future. And they are some of the main drivers of this work. Not to mention the fact that so many of our citizens now, particularly in a pandemic era, are now so used to a cashless existence. It's more used now to paying with a phone than they are with paying with a purse or a wallet. And that has changed our expectations of a currency. And that, of course, is also a motivation for the consideration that's underway.
So you emphasized a lot that, you know, the digital euro should actually be a protective measure to protect essentially the sovereignty, the monetary sovereignty of the euro area. But some people might also see it as a measure to do some euroization or digital dollarization of other countries. Do you think the international expansion of the euro, the importance as a reserve currency, also used as a payment currency, is also a motivation for the digital euro, or that's much less so?
Yeah. So, and thank you for putting that question to me. If I could elaborate, for me, if we decide to proceed with an euro, that is not for me as a defensive response. It is very much a sign of confidence in the future of our currency. I'm simply acknowledging that there are many developments, particularly within the private sector, that are relevant to that decision, but it wouldn't be the only driver of that decision. To deal with your question then regarding the international role of the euro and its future as a reserve currency, yes, I do think that if the euro were to have a digital future, that does have the potential to strengthen the role of the euro as a reserve currency and as a even more globally significant currency. However, I think that's a bit away. It is such a complex project, and while many sovereigns have talked about doing it, few actually have so far because of the complexity involved in it, both technically and from a policy point of view. And I think before we get to the euro, there are many other policy areas that will contribute to whether the euro has an even bigger international role. And the most obvious one is the credibility of our efforts to recover from COVID quickly. And secondly, actually, to go back to the earlier topic that you raised, to admit me, I believe the green future of the euro would actually be a source of growth for our currency and a source of deepening its role. So I think there are other areas that could contribute more quickly to the international role of the euro.
And what's about a common bond market or some, it doesn't need to be a euro bond. Is the green bond typically, do you view it as more as a European level? Do you see it as a big bond market or some bond structure?
So
like
it's that green bonds. Sorry, Markus, was that green bonds that you said?
Yeah, you mentioned green bonds earlier.
Oh, yeah.
I think it will be a large enough market to, euro-denominated market, bond market to be a liquid market and also to establish essentially the euro as a more international currency.
Yes, I do. Again, I know it will take time. The reason, however, I have that confidence is I look at the demand for green bonds at the moment. I think it was only yesterday, for example, that our friends in Germany issued a green bond that was very heavily oversubscribed versus expectations. We have now done the same in Ireland, where we have again seen a huge market appetite for it. I am aware of the scale of it at the moment, that it will need to grow further in the future to get the kind of liquidity that is relevant to our discussions regarding reserve currencies. But I believe that will happen. And I go back to the discussion that you and I had about ESG. The reason why I believe that will happen is I believe the demand is there within the financial markets and the investment community for that to happen.
So if I look at the monetary system at the moment, it's very much a private-public partnership, a PPP, between the central banks or the public sector and the private banks. But in the future, there might be a third player, which are the big tech companies playing a role as well. How do you see the interplay now, which is now, two players, now we will have three players interacting, and part of the big techs are platforms, and where do you see the regulation on this? So on the one side, these platforms will impact the monetary side, how money is created and how money is exchanged. On the other side, there is a lot of interoperability issues, privacy issues on platforms. What's the current thinking in this space?
Yes, indeed. I mean, how you define money and how you create money is at the very heart of not only economies, but is also at the very heart of the political constructs that sit over economies. From my point of view, while I do believe digital innovation and the role of the private sector will be important in driving convenience and efficiency regarding how transactions are funded and how they are implemented, I also strongly believe that the ability of sovereigns to be economically effective and the ability of sovereigns to share economic sovereignty is also related to both how they define, how they supply, and how they regulate the supply of money. That is an area as a politician and as a European politician that I believe is very, very important, and I believe we need to strengthen it in the future. And again, I don't want to create the impression that I spend all my days and nights reading every paper you've published, Markus, because I think that would be too flattering and not credible. But I did read a paper that you wrote on the digitization of money. And one of the early points that you made is how you define money depends on what the anchor is and the relationship between the sovereign anchor and sovereign currencies. And I think that's exceptionally important. And we're very much aware of that within Europe. We value and recognize private sector innovation, but we also believe that financial stability, we also believe that consumer protection, and we also believe that preserving the integrity of monetary policy transmission is really, really important. And there are things that we're very conscious of in the policy debate that is underway.
But do you see, let's suppose in the future, if it were to be the case that platforms play a central role and enhance efficiency, and there are two outcomes. One is that the banks will become more platforms as well, or the platforms will be organized by more technology companies and fintechs and the Alibabas of the world and the Amazons of the world. And the transition from a bank-focused to a platform-focused financial system might be quite, unstable, even though in the long run it might be a better steady state, better outcome, but to get there might be a risk. Do you think Europe will make this step, or think rather than stay with the traditional way and perhaps the easier, the less risky ways to convert the banks into platforms?
But sure, in the world that we are in, traditional ways of how we engage with each other are always in constant change. So making the case for traditionalism within economic policy completely underestimates the magnitude of change that's just pulsing through all of our lives and our economies at the moment. So I believe platforms are not only important at the moment, they're going to be more important in the future. And that is, but I do believe a good and strong regulatory framework around the operation of such platforms is really, really important, particularly when we get into the area of how those platforms will engage with the current banking structures that we have, whether they be traditional or not. And what has now happened, Markus, which your participants may be aware of, is the Commission has now published a thing called the Digital Markets Act. And what they are looking at now is how tech platforms operate and the expectations that we have of them from a transparency point of view and also from a consumer protection point of view, and the obligations that we expect them to deliver in response to the economic benefit they will get from themselves by their creation. So as they grow, we will expect them to meet regulatory requirements, because their growth is important to financial stability and is important to the effectiveness of policy decisions that need to be made by central bankers and need to be made by politicians.
Thanks a lot. So I was wondering whether we can spend a few more minutes at the end on Brexit. Brexit was just implemented a few months ago, and I was wondering whether there are any surprises you've learned from the implementation for Europe as a whole and for Ireland in particular.
Well, Markus, I could spend hours talking to you about Brexit, and not so long ago, Brexit was the biggest challenge and crisis that we were facing until we entered into the dark days of COVID. So what have I learned about Brexit, and what kind of surprises has it brought? Well, I'd pick out two. The first one is that it has reminded me never to take political agreements and constructs and organizations for granted. It has reminded me that we need to continually make the case for the social and political acceptance of things that we believe are important. I believe the European Union is incredibly important. I'm an Irish citizen and a European citizen. Both parts of my identity enrich each other. And I've certainly learned from Brexit about the need to make the case for the value of Europe again and again and again. And I've also learned the dangers of simple claims in politics. That you make a simple claim, a simple charge, you win the support of a majority behind it. But then the consequences become so complex and so profound. From an Irish point of view, we spent years getting ready for it. It has benefited our financial sector, benefited it quite strongly, but it has had really big consequences for other parts of our economy, particularly agriculture, particularly goods that we export from Ireland. And then the thing that has mattered so much has been the Good Friday Agreement and the political stability of our island. And this government, the last government here in Ireland, but years of work, Markus now, years of work into how we preserve that. And the truth is that we will be putting years of work into this again.
And perhaps we can spend a few more sentences describing how Ireland evolved in the last few decades. The way I envision Ireland is that I guess the difference between Northern and Southern, the Republic of Ireland, was way bigger in terms of being more Catholic and divorce laws, and abortion. All of this has probably changed significantly in the last few decades, if you look 30 years back or 40 years back. Is this a fair description?
Yeah, the social change within Ireland and the political change within Ireland has been incredible. And it has been it has been difficult at times. And as a politician, I've been privileged to play a role in some of that change, but it has been driven by our people who wanted to see change. The truth of us is there was much pain, so much difficulty in the lives of Irish women, in the lives of Irish children for too long. And we have had to respond back to that in a way that may be compassionate now, and I may be proud of it now, but for so long, so much difficulty was endured by so many. And we've had a number of referenda here in Ireland in relation to the availability of abortion within our country, and also in relation to how we define marriage, to ensure that all citizens in Ireland are treated equally in front of our constitution, just as all love is equal and all care is equal. And it has been amazing change. And we are a very different country to where we were a number of decades ago. But we have much change that we still need to make. Many citizens in Ireland would still not feel that our social contract has been honoured. They wouldn't feel that we are responding back to the needs of our society effectively. So while I am proud of the change that has happened, I know we still have much to do.
So typically we end the webinar on a positive note. Here I'll probably change it a little bit. If you had one wish towards Europe, what would you wish to your fellow finance be?
Oh my God, if I had one wish for my fellow finance ministers, well, I guess it would be quite a human one at the moment. In engaging with all of my finance minister colleagues at the moment across Europe, we have all seen so much difficulty for so many of our citizens. We've seen lives being lost, health being affected so much, and we're all hoping that we will get to a summer in which we will be able to travel again, and in which friends and families will be able to meet each other safely again as we approach the summer. And the social, the mental health, and the well-being benefits of that would be so tremendous and so important. And of course, the economic consequences of it as well are so essential. So that is what we're all hoping for. I can't wait to get my hair cut here in Ireland. Our hairdressers have just opened up again. And I have many finance minister colleagues all over Europe that they probably already have their hair cut, unlike me. But to see those parts of our economies open up again is so important and so needed. And we want to continue on that journey.
Thanks a lot.
And Markus, may I conclude with a different note, if you don't mind, because in this great time of change, I think what many of us have done is, we go back to writers and thinkers that have encountered periods of disruption in our past. And we read them and think about them again to help us make sense of the present. And here in Europe and in Ireland, for example, writers like Orwell and Camus, his book, The Plague, they've become really popular all over again. And one of the political texts that many have, or few anyway, have gone back to is by a writer that is very, very important to Princeton, who's Hannah Arendt, who I learned actually was the first woman ever to become a lecturer within Princeton after such a difficult time within Europe. And this year marks the 70th anniversary of the book that she wrote entitled The Origins of Totalitarianism, which is a very wise book for many of the challenges that we have at the moment. And I read this across last year and this year as I was trying to make sense of the present. And as I was getting ready for our conversation, I was having a look at the book again. And one sentence I felt was very relevant politically to many of the economic challenges that you and I have discussed, which is at the conclusion of her book, she noted the following, which is that the stability of the laws corresponds to constant motion of all human affairs, a motion which can never end as long as men are born and die. And I think she was making the point that the value of laws and the stability of laws also has to depend on the fact that there is always change and always change around us. And I just feel that is appropriate to the work of academic communities, to Princeton, and then to politicians like myself. If we're making the case for political order and for laws and for projects like Europe and European economic and political integration, we always have to know that we have to constantly renew them and constantly depend on human inquiry to help us understand them and make the case for them. And that's something we depend on the academic community for, and it's something that Princeton, of course, makes a big contribution to. So thank you for the opportunity to participate in this seminar, and I hope at some point you might invite me to your campus so that we'll be able to do it physically.
We will do. I can't top what your conclusion, so I'll leave it at that. And I'm very grateful for your interventions, and I think we learned a lot, and we have a much better picture how you will steward Europe into its future, to a better future. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Markus, and stay safe.
Stay safe too. Bye-bye.